She had nothing left. No family, no money, no plan. Just a torn piece of newspaper, a pair of worn-out boots, and 7 miles of empty Kansas prairie stretching out ahead of her. Most women would have turned back. Maren Adler kept walking. What she found at the end of that dirt road wasn't just a job. It was a collision between two broken lives that neither of them saw coming. This is the story of what happens when survival stops being enough, and something terrifying called belonging starts to take its place. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The advertisement was 4 lines long. Maren had read it so many times over the past 2 days that she could close her eyes and see the ink pressed into the newsprint, slightly smudged on the left edge where the typesetter had rushed the press. Harvest help wanted. Blackstone Ranch, 7 miles north of Dalton Creek. Inquire in person. No letter necessary. No letter necessary. That was the part that had made her stop breathing for a moment when she first read it, sitting on the edge of a wooden crate outside Harmon's general store, with the wind picking at her skirt and the October sky going gray and mean overhead. No letter meant no reference required. No letter meant nobody had to vouch for her. No letter meant a woman with nothing but $2.40 in her coat pocket and a carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world might still have a chance at something. She had torn the advertisement out carefully, folded it twice, and tucked it into her left boot because it was the only place she trusted not to lose it. That had been Thursday. It was now Saturday morning, and Maren Adler was standing at the edge of Dalton Creek's only road, heading north, staring at 7 miles of open Kansas prairie like it was a personal enemy she was about to pick a fight with. The town behind her wasn't much. A feed store, a post office, a saloon that smelled like bad decisions even at this hour, a church with a cracked bell tower, and about 24 residents who had been watching her with that particular brand of small-town suspicion she'd grown familiar with over the past 4 days. She'd arrived on the Tuesday stage with a carpet bag and no explanation, paid for 2 nights at the boarding house run by a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Holt, and spent those 2 days quietly trying to figure out what in the world she was going to do next. The money situation was not good. $2.40 sounds like something until you do the arithmetic. 2 more nights at Mrs. Holt's would leave her with 60 cents, which was not enough to do anything except feel bad about having only 60 cents. She had no trade to speak of, not in the way the town needed. She could cook, clean, sew, keep accounts, and had spent the last 3 years managing her father's household after her mother passed, but none of those things were hanging on a sign in Dalton Creek looking for a taker. Her father had passed in August. She did not like to think about August. And then there was her uncle's family in Wichita, who had taken her in for exactly 11 days before her aunt had made it quietly but firmly clear that an extra mouth was an extra mouth, and that Maren was 24 years old and capable of finding her own situation. Her cousin Delia had slipped her $1 and a guilty look at the door. Her uncle had not come out of his study to say goodbye. So, 7 miles of Kansas prairie, a torn newspaper advertisement in her boot, $2.40. Maren picked up her carpet bag and started walking. The first 2 miles weren't bad. The road was rutted but solid, the kind of packed earth that held a boot without argument, and the morning light was doing that thing it sometimes did over the plains where it turned everything amber and quiet and almost beautiful if you didn't look too hard at the poverty of the landscape. She kept her eyes on the road and her thoughts on practical things. What she would say when she got there, how she would present herself, whether to mention the accounting work or lead with the cooking. The 3rd mile was when the wind started. Not a storm wind, not yet. Just that low, persistent Kansas push that never really stopped, that found the gaps in your coat and worked at them patiently, that took the warmth you'd built up walking and steadily dismantled it. She'd grown up in Ohio, and Ohio had wind, but Ohio wind had the decency to at least come from a specific direction. Kansas wind seemed to be working on some kind of rotation, and it was rotating directly into her face no matter which way the road bent. She stopped at mile 4 to set down the carpet bag and rest her arms and eat the biscuit she'd wrapped in a cloth and put in her pocket that morning. It was dry and tasted like salt and not much else, but it was hers. She stood in the middle of the empty road and ate it and looked at the land around her. There was so much of it. That was the thing about Kansas that still unsettled her even after weeks in it. The sheer indifferent vastness of the place. The way the horizon went on and on with nothing to interrupt it. No hills, no tree lines worth mentioning, nothing to give your eyes a place to rest. Back home in Ohio, there had always been something. A barn in the middle distance, a line of maples along a fence, a church spire catching the light, something that said people live here and the land acknowledges them. Out here, the land didn't acknowledge anything. The land was just the land, enormous and flat and utterly unconcerned with whatever small human drama was walking across it. Marin ate her biscuit. She watched a hawk make slow circles in the gray sky. She picked up her carpet bag and kept walking. She saw the ranch at mile 6.5, though saw is generous. She saw a dark shape in the distance that resolved slowly into the outline of buildings, and then a little closer into a house and a barn, and what looked like several smaller structures beyond, and then closer still into a place that was clearly working hard just to hold itself together. The house was wood frame, 2 stories, weathered to that particular silver gray that Kansas sun and wind did to wood over years of patient abuse. The porch roof sagged slightly on the left side. One of the shutters on the upper windows was hanging at an angle, the top hinge having given up. The fence line along the road was in decent repair. Someone had been keeping up with it recently. But the gate at the entrance had been propped open with a stone and looked like it hadn't been properly closed in some time. Beyond the house, the barn was large and relatively solid-looking, and she could see the darker shapes of livestock moving in the near field. A haystack that looked partially done. Equipment she couldn't name from this distance. Signs of work in progress everywhere. The scattered evidence of an operation that had too much to do and not quite enough hands to do it. She stood at the stone-propped gate for a moment, catching her breath from the last half-mile, and thought, not for the first time, that this was probably insane. Walking 7 miles to a stranger's ranch to ask for work, with nothing to recommend her but 4 lines of newspaper advertisement and a determination that had not yet decided to become something more sensible. Her father used to say that courage and stupidity looked identical right up until the moment they didn't. She was never entirely sure which one she was operating on at any given time, and she didn't know now either. She walked through the gate. The yard between the gate and the house was maybe 60 feet, and she had covered about half of it when the front door opened. The man who came out onto the sagging porch was somewhere in his mid-30s, though he had the look of someone who had been adding years faster than the calendar did. Tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that comes not from intention, but from years of physical work, wide through the shoulders and chest, his face weathered and angular under a dark beard that needed attention. He wore canvas work trousers, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and an expression that managed to combine wariness, exhaustion, and a very well-developed skepticism all at once. He stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at her. She stopped in the yard and looked at him. "I'm looking for Blackstone Ranch," she said. "You found it." His voice was low, careful, not unfriendly, but not particularly the opposite of that either. "I saw your advertisement in the Dalton Creek paper." She reached into her coat pocket and then remembered the advertisement was in her boot, and made the split-second decision not to pull it out of her boot in front of a stranger. "About harvest help." He looked at her for a moment, not in a rude way, more like a man processing information that didn't fit neatly into any category he'd been expecting. "You walked from town?" "Yes, 7 miles. "I'm aware." Something shifted very slightly in his expression, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to it. "Caleb Mercer," he said, and came down the 2 porch steps. "Marin Adler." He looked at her carpet bag. "You brought your bag." "I didn't know if—" She stopped, squared herself. "I didn't know what the situation would be regarding accommodations. The advertisement didn't specify." "I see." He said nothing else for a moment. She had the distinct feeling she was being assessed with a thoroughness that would have been rude in a parlor and was perfectly reasonable here on the edge of a struggling Kansas ranch with winter 7 weeks out. "How much ranch work have you done?" he asked. "None," she said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that, but I've managed a household for 3 years. I can cook, I can preserve, I can keep accounts if you need that, and I learn fast. The advertisement said harvest help. I can work. My last hired hand left 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry to hear that. Took some of my tools with him when he went." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "I'm sorry," again, which wasn't brilliant but was at least honest. Caleb Mercer looked at the sky. That habitual Western rancher's look she would come to know well over the coming weeks, the unconscious assessment of weather and time, and what the light was telling you about what the next 12 hours were going to be, and then looked back at her. "I've got wheat still in the field. I've got winter coming. I've got a house that—" He stopped. "I've got a lot of work and not enough hands." "So do I," Marin said. "A lot of work and not enough hands, and nowhere else to go." That hung in the cold air between them. He nodded, a short, deliberate dip of his chin. "Room is in the house. East-facing. Small. Small is fine. Meals are included. Wages $1.50 a week." She'd been hoping for $2, but $1.50 was more than 60 cents, and a return trip to Dalton Creek with no prospects. "Agreed. You'll need different boots," he said, looking at hers. "Those won't last the month out here." "I'll manage what I have." He picked up her carpet bag from where she'd set it down, which startled her. She hadn't expected that, and turned back toward the house. "Come on then, I'll show you the room." She followed him across the yard and up the 2 porch steps and through the front door of Blackstone Ranch. And the first thing she noticed was that the house smelled like old coffee and wood smoke and something else underneath, something that she could only describe as the particular smell of a house where someone had stopped trying. The room was indeed small. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, a window that looked east toward the open prairie. The curtains were faded blue cotton that had probably been cheerful about 5 years ago. There was a hook on the back of the door and a small iron stove in the corner that someone had laid a fire in at some recent point, the ash still showing in the tray. Caleb set her bag down beside the bed. "Outhouse is around the back of the barn. Pump for water is in the kitchen. I get up at 5. "I'll be up at 4:30, she said. He looked at her again with that difficult-to-read expression. "You don't have to. If I'm going to know the house by the time you need me in the field, I need time to learn it first. 4:30 gives me that." A pause. "Supper's at 6. There's food in the kitchen. Can you—" "I'll handle supper," she said. He nodded, turned to leave, got to the door and then stopped, his hand on the frame, his back still to her. "My boy," he said. "He's 7. His name is Henry. He doesn't warm up to people fast." "I understand." His mother— Another stop, longer this time. "It's been 4 years." "I understand," she said again, and meant it differently this time. He left without another word, and she heard his boots on the floorboards going down the stairs, and then the front door, and then nothing but the wind pushing at the east-facing window. Marin sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. She put her hands in her lap and looked at the faded blue curtains. She thought about her father's house in Ohio, which someone else was living in now. She thought about her aunt's kitchen in Wichita, where she had peeled potatoes for 11 days and felt every minute of her unwelcomeness in the rigid set of her aunt's shoulders. She thought about the 4 lines of newsprint she'd torn from the paper and carried in her boot for 2 days across 7 miles of Kansas wind. Then she stood up, opened her carpet bag, shook out her second dress, and hung it on the hook behind the door, and went to find the kitchen. Marmoset. The kitchen was in worse shape than she'd expected, which was saying something because she'd been expecting fairly bad. It wasn't dirty, exactly. Or rather, it wasn't the dirt of a person who didn't care, but the dirt of a person who cared about other things more and had been managing too many of those other things for too long. The dishes were washed and stacked, but the cast-iron skillet had a layer of old grease that had gone rancid. The pantry was disorganized in a particular way that said survival thinking, where things were shoved in based on urgency rather than any system. 2 sacks of flour behind a broken lantern, canned goods mixed with tools, a heel of bread next to a jar of machine oil. The floor needed sweeping with a commitment. The window over the wash basin had a crack in the lower right corner that had been there long enough for dirt to have built up in it. But the stove was good, a proper cast-iron range that had been maintained even when other things hadn't been. And when she checked the flue and opened the firebox, she found enough coals still glowing that she could have a fire going in 10 minutes. The pantry had potatoes, dried beans, salt pork, onions, a can of peaches, cornmeal, and various other provisions. Not lavish, but honest. She found an apron hanging on a peg near the stove that was several sizes too large for her and put it on anyway. She found a broom and spent 15 minutes on the floor. She cleared the jar of machine oil away from the bread. She located a bucket and went to the pump in the corner and filled it, set it on the stove to heat. She was rendering the salt pork for the beans when she heard small feet on the stairs. She didn't turn around immediately. She'd learned over years of managing a household that turning around too fast when children were being cautious about you was the wrong instinct. It put them on notice that you'd noticed them, and that was when they retreated. So she kept her attention on the skillet and waited. The feet stopped somewhere in the doorway. She could feel the assessment happening. She'd felt it from the father, too, and apparently it ran in families. She turned the salt pork over in the skillet with a long-handled fork. The kitchen filled with that smell, warm and savory, that is one of the oldest reliable comforts in the world. After a while, she said, without turning around, "Your father mentioned your name was Henry." Silence. "Mine's Marin. I know that's a strange name. Most people can't say it right the first time." A very small voice from the doorway. "I said it right." "You did. That's unusual." She turned around then, slowly, keeping her hands visible and her expression ordinary. Henry Mercer was small for 7. Not unhealthily so, just compactly built, with his father's dark hair and what looked like it might have been his mother's eyes, wide set and dark brown, watching her from under a fringe of hair that needed cutting. He had on overalls and one sock and no shoes, and he was holding a wooden horse in his left hand with the casual negligence of a child who doesn't know they're carrying it. "I'm making beans," she said. "Are you hungry?" He looked at the stove, looked at her. "Pa makes beans different." "How does your pa make beans?" A small shrug. "With more water, they come out more like soup." "Do you like them that way?" Another shrug, which she interpreted correctly as "I eat them that way." "Do you like them like soup?" she asked. "Not really." "All right, I'll make them not like soup. If you don't like them, tell me and we'll adjust." She turned back to the stove. "You can sit at the table if you want. You don't have to." She heard, after a moment, the sound of the chair being pulled out. Supper was beans over cornbread, which she'd managed in the cast iron, and sliced onions and vinegar that she'd found in the back of the pantry. It wasn't remarkable food, but it was solid and hot and seasoned properly, which was 3 things she suspected hadn't been consistent in this kitchen for a while. Caleb came in from outside at 2 minutes to 6, stamped his boots on the mat inside the door, washed his hands at the pump, and sat down at the head of the table. He looked at the food. He looked at Henry, who was already seated and had been carrying on a one-sided explanation to Marin about the wooden horse's name, which was Captain, and Captain's various qualities. "Smells good," Caleb said, in a tone that suggested he was being careful about how much he said. "It's simple food," she said. "I'll get a better sense of the pantry over the next few days." She sat, and they ate. There was not a great deal of conversation. Caleb was a man who seemed to take eating seriously, as something that needed to be done rather than a social occasion, and she respected that. Henry ate with the focused attention of a hungry child, which was its own kind of answer to several questions she'd been quietly having. When his bowl was empty, he looked at the pot on the stove. "Can I have more?" he asked, looking at Marin rather than his father. She glanced at Caleb. He gave a short nod. "Go ahead," she said. "The spoon's right there." Henry got up, served himself, sat back down. Caleb watched this without comment, but she noticed his hand stop moving for a moment, fork halfway to his plate, before he resumed eating. After supper, while she was washing up, Caleb came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd left on the stove. "The Farfield," he said. "Still got wheat standing. I've been trying to time the cut between storms. Last week was a loss because of the rain. How much is left?" "Enough that losing it would hurt bad." He drank his coffee, leaned against the counter with the expression of a man calculating things he didn't like the numbers on. "I've been cutting alone since Dykes left, going slow." "I can help," she said. "You said you haven't done field work." "I said I haven't. I didn't say I couldn't." He looked at her steadily. "It's hard work. Harder than it looks." "Mr. Mercer." She set down the dish she was drying. I walked 7 miles across open prairie in October with a carpet bag and a dress that isn't warm enough for this weather to apply for a job I've never done before. I'm not going to melt at a wheat field. Something happened in his face. Not a smile still, not quite, but the armor that sat on his features relaxed one increment. 5 a.m., he said. Field work starts then. You'll need gloves. I'll find some. He finished his coffee, set the cup down on the counter with a heavy, deliberate clunk, and walked toward the door. Stopped again. He had a habit of that, she was noticing, of getting to the door and stopping, like he kept having second thoughts about things he'd decided. Thank you, he said, without turning around. For supper. You're welcome. He left, and she could hear him going down the hall toward the back of the house, and then the low murmur of his voice as he found Henry, and Henry's higher, faster answering voice. And she stood in the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands and listened to the sound of other people's ordinary life going on around her. She had forgotten, she thought, what that sounded like. The next morning, she was up at 4:15. She was not, she would admit to herself if she was being honest, a person who sprang out of bed. She was a person who set her teeth and got out of bed, which was different but got the same result. The east-facing room was cold. The little iron stove had let the fire die sometime around 2, and the floor planks were cold under her feet, and the air bit at her face and hands while she dressed in the dark. She went down to the kitchen and got the range going and put water on and found a cloth sack that had enough oats in it for porridge and got that started. She found the bread she'd seen in the pantry and cut it and put it near the stove to warm through. She swept again because the kitchen floor seemed to generate dirt autonomously, and she had decided the kitchen floor was now her particular enemy. Caleb came downstairs at 4:57. She heard him pause in the hall when he smelled the coffee. He came into the kitchen and looked at the table, the porridge, the warmed bread, the coffee, and then at her. You didn't have to do all this, he said. The oats were going stale, she said. Better to use them. He sat down. She set a bowl in front of him and one for herself and poured the coffee, and they ate in the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable so much as honest. Outside the window, the sky was that deep, cold blue that comes before dawn in October, and the wind was already there, already at work, already making itself known. I'll take you through the field work this morning, he said, when he'd eaten half the porridge. Show you what needs doing. All right, it's going to be a cold day. He looked at her coat, which was hanging on the peg by the back door. That coat isn't going to be enough. It's all I have. He was quiet for a moment. There's an old jacket of my wife's, in the chest in the bedroom. You can use it. It's just taking up space. She almost said I couldn't, which was her first instinct, the polite refusal. But her first instincts had gotten her exactly nowhere good lately, and it was October in Kansas, and her coat was not going to be enough. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded and ate the rest of his porridge. And when they both got up to go outside, she went up to the bedroom he'd indicated and opened the chest and found the jacket. It was heavy wool, dark green, with brass buttons, still good. She put it on and it was too wide in the shoulders and too long in the arms, but it was warm, genuinely warm. And she rolled the sleeves up and followed Caleb Mercer out into the cold Kansas morning. The wheat field was a 30-minute walk north of the house, past the barn and the equipment shed and through 2 gates. What was standing looked good. She could tell that even without knowing the first thing about wheat, golden and full-headed, rippling in the wind that was already pushing down out of the north with a new edge on it. What was also standing, she noticed, was Caleb, with a scythe, looking at the field with the expression of a man doing mathematics that weren't coming out right. Storm came through 12 days ago, he said, still looking at the field. Lost the north section. What's left here is maybe 60% of what I'd expected to put up. And you've been cutting alone. Me and Henry when he gets back from school. He's too young to swing a scythe, but he can rake and bundle. He finally looked at her. You ever handled a scythe? No, I didn't think so. I'll put you on raking and bundling. Slower than 2 scythes, but I can't teach you to swing safely in a morning. What can I learn? He looked at her. To swing safely. Then teach me. He taught her with the patient, practical thoroughness of a man who understood that time was worth more than pride on either side of the teaching. He was not what she'd call warm about it. There were no encouragements, no good job Marins, but he was precise and honest, which she found she valued more. When she was holding the scythe wrong, he corrected her without drama. When she took a first swing that was too wide and killed the rhythm, he told her exactly why without making it seem like an indictment. By the end of the first hour, she was raking. Her shoulders were already complaining. By noon, she was moving slower but still moving, which she decided to count as a victory. They stopped to eat. She'd put biscuits and salt pork and dried apple in a cloth tied to her belt like she'd seen done, though not gracefully, and sat on the cut wheat stubble with the October sky enormous and still gray overhead. Caleb ate without talking. She ate without talking. The wind worked away at everything. "How long has the ranch been struggling?" she asked, because she was never good at silence that held questions in it. He glanced at her, not annoyed exactly, but measuring. "What makes you think it's struggling?" "The fence near the south gate needs 3 new posts. The barn roof has a patch that's been patched before. The pantry's low on things it shouldn't be low on by October." He looked back at the field. 4 years, he said. "Since your wife." "Since Eleanor, yes." He said the name carefully, like something he'd practiced saying in a certain way. "She kept the household accounts." I wasn't paying close enough attention to how much that mattered until it wasn't there." "And Dykes?" "The hired hand." "Dykes was good worker when he wasn't drinking. Problem was, he was drinking more than he was working toward the end." He paused. "I kept him on longer than I should have. Didn't want to manage the problem." She nodded and said nothing, because that was an honest admission and deserved not to be piled on. "You keep the accounts in order?" he asked after a moment. "Yes. My father's business records for 3 years. He was a hardware merchant in Delaware, Ohio. The kind of business where if you don't watch the books, you don't catch the small losses until they're big losses." He was quiet for a moment. "I might take you up on that, looking at the books." "Whenever you're ready." They finished eating. The wind had a real bite to it now, coming down from the north, and when Maren stood up, she could feel it through even the heavy wool jacket. Caleb stood up and looked at the sky. He did that long look, the weather look, eyes moving slowly from north to west to east and back. "We need to move," he said. "Storm?" Maybe not yet, but..." He started walking back to where they'd left the scythe and rake. "We need to move." She followed him back into the field. Her shoulders were screaming and her hands were already starting to blister under the gloves, and there were 7 miles of Kansas prairie between her and Dalton Creek, which was in the other direction from everything she'd ever known. She picked up the rake. 3 days into it, she began to understand the ranch. Not to understand it the way you understand a simple thing, but the way you start to understand a person. In pieces, each one revising the picture slightly from what you'd had before. She learned the pump in the kitchen ran cold in the morning and lukewarm by afternoon. She learned the east gate latch needed to be lifted and pulled simultaneously, or it stuck. She learned that the 2 milk cows in the barn had personalities. The brown one, who had no name she could find out, was agreeable and stood quietly. The black and white one, whose name, according to Henry, was Duchess of Trouble, was exactly that. She learned Henry in pieces too. He was 7 and angry about it. The way some children are angry about being small in a big world that hadn't consulted them. He was smart, quick with words, observant in the way of children who've spent a lot of time being quiet in adult company. And he had a stubbornness that she recognized as genetic because she saw it applied differently, but equally in his father. He didn't trust her, not yet, not really. But he ate the food she made and brought Captain the wooden horse into the kitchen sometimes when she was working, and that was something. On the 4th day, he asked, "Were you always alone?" She was making bread, had her hands in the dough, and she didn't stop or look up. "No, I had my father." "Where is he?" "He died. In August." Henry sat with this. He was at the table, Captain, making small roads in a dusting of flour she hadn't gotten to yet. "My ma died 4 years ago," he said. "I know." "Pa doesn't talk about it." "No," she said. "Some people can't." "Can you talk about it, your pa?" She turned the dough over. "I can. He was a good man. He liked bad weather. Not like storms, but cloudy days. Days when the sky was doing something interesting. He always said clear days were boring." Henry thought about this. "My ma liked yellow things," he offered. "Pa told me. Said she'd pick yellow flowers even when there were prettier ones." "That's a lovely thing to know about someone," Maren said. Henry looked at Captain for a moment. "I don't remember her much," he said, which was the most honest and most painful thing she'd heard since she arrived, delivered in the casual, matter-of-fact tone that children use for the things that hurt most, because they haven't learned yet to dress those things up. "That's hard," she said. "Yeah." She braided the dough and put it in the pan and set it near the stove to rise, and Henry made roads with Captain in the flour dust, and neither of them said anything else, and that was enough. On the 6th day, she found the accounts. She hadn't asked again after Caleb's half-invitation in the field. She'd decided to let that be his move, since she was still new enough that pushing felt wrong. But she was reorganizing the back shelf of the pantry when she found a tin box pushed behind a sack of cornmeal, and when she lifted it, the lid wasn't locked, and when she opened it, she saw the papers. She closed it again immediately. At supper that evening, she said, "I found a tin box in the pantry. I didn't read it, but I think it may be your accounts." Caleb's fork stopped. He looked at her across the table. "On the back shelf?" "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Henry was eating with his characteristic focused efficiency. "I'll look at it," Caleb said. "If you want help." "I'll look at it first," he said. "Of course." She looked back at her plate. After Henry was in bed and she was washing the supper dishes, she heard the scrape of the tin box being opened in the next room. She heard the quiet, very particular sound of a man sorting through papers he'd been avoiding. She heard eventually a slow exhale that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word, but was clearly a man confronting numbers that were worse than he'd been telling himself they were. She finished the dishes and left the kitchen clean and went to bed, and she didn't say anything. He came to find her the next morning before 5. She was already in the kitchen, naturally, and he came in wearing his outdoor clothes like he'd been up a while, and he poured himself coffee and stood at the counter, looking at it, and then he said, "The accounts are worse than I thought." "I'm sorry." "I'm not looking for sorry." He said it without sharpness. "I'm looking for... I need someone to look at them with me, to see what I'm missing." "All right." She dried her hands. "Now?" He looked at her as though the possibility of now had not occurred to him, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. "Now," he said, and pushed off the counter. They sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, the tin box open between them, and she went through the papers while he watched. She was methodical about it, sorting by date, then by type, building a picture slowly so she could explain it rather than just deliver a verdict. There were debts she hadn't expected, a land note with an interest rate that was quietly compounding in the background like a slow leak, provisions bought on credit at Harmon's store over the past 18 months, 2 pieces of equipment that had needed repair and been repaired at costs that strained what a good harvest should have easily covered. It wasn't disaster, not yet. But it was the kind of situation that became disaster with one bad season, and she suspected he knew it. "The note on the land," she said. "What's the arrangement?" 5 years? I'm in year 3. "And the interest?" He told her. She wrote down the number and looked at it and did the arithmetic. "That needs to be the first priority," she said. "Not the Harmon's debt. That can be managed season to season. But this needs to be current or the interest runs ahead of you. The harvest would cover it, if it goes well." "Yes." She looked at the papers again. "There are also 3 things here you're paying for that you don't need to be paying for. Or not this way." She showed him. He leaned over to look, and she explained, and he listened, genuinely listened. Not the polite listening of a man waiting to dismiss an idea, but the real listening of someone encountering a perspective he hadn't had. "I didn't know that about the tax assessment," he said, looking at one of the papers. "It's easy to miss. My father had the same issue for 2 years before his banker mentioned it." Caleb sat back in his chair and looked at the tin box with the expression of a man who has just been told the situation is difficult but not hopeless, which is a complicated thing to feel. "My wife was better at this than she thought she was," he said. "She always said she was just writing down numbers, but the writing down the numbers was what kept us ahead." "It usually is," Marin said. He looked at her, not assessing this time. Or not only that, something else in it, something she couldn't quite name, that she decided not to try to name. "What do you want?" he asked. "From this, from being here." The question startled her because it was honest and direct, and she hadn't expected it. "What do you mean?" "You walked 7 miles. You left wherever you came from. You're here." He gestured at the kitchen, the ranch, the dark outside the window. What is it you're looking for? She thought about it, gave it the real thought it deserved, because he was asking for honesty, and dishonesty felt wrong in this kitchen at this hour. I don't know yet, she said. I know what I left. I know I can't go back to it. The forward part is still unclear. He nodded, like this was an answer he understood. What about you? She asked, because it seemed fair. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the wind was doing its early morning business, low and persistent. I've been managing, he said at last, just managing, for 4 years, and I think… He stopped, looked at the tin box. I think I'd stopped expecting anything to get better. She said nothing. Let that sit. Sometimes the most important things a person says need a moment of silence around them so they can hear themselves have said it. He closed the tin box and stood up. It's almost 5, he said. Field. Yes, she said, and got up and put on Eleanor's jacket and followed him out into the cold morning. She did not know, could not have said in that moment, that the forward part she couldn't see clearly was already beginning to take shape right in front of her, in a cold Kansas kitchen with a tin box of bad numbers, and a man who had just, for the first time in 4 years, said out loud that things might be allowed to get better. She did not know it, but she was walking toward it. The second week was harder than the first, which Marin had not entirely anticipated, though she probably should have. The first week had the advantage of novelty. Everything was new enough that the difficulty of it was absorbed into the newness, softened by the simple business of learning where things were and how things worked and what the rhythm of the place demanded. By the second week, that buffer was gone. She knew where everything was. She knew the rhythm, and knowing it meant she could no longer be distracted from how relentless it actually was. 4:30. Fire in the kitchen range, water on, porridge or biscuits depending on what the pantry could spare that morning. Feed the chickens. There were 9 of them, bad-tempered and unimpressed by consistency. Milk the cows, the agreeable one first, then Duchess of Trouble, who had to be approached like a negotiation. Get Henry up and fed and his lunch wrapped and his boots laced, because he could lace his own boots but did it wrong, and then tripped on the field, and she'd learned this on day 3. See Henry off when the neighbor's boy came to walk with him to the schoolhouse 2 miles down the road. Back inside to wash up from breakfast, make some assessment of what needed doing in the house, and then either that or the field, depending on where Caleb needed her more that day. The field was winning, most days. The weather wasn't right yet, hadn't turned hard, but it was hinting. That north wind had something to say, and it wasn't saying it kindly, and Caleb moved through every day with the pressed urgency of a man watching a clock he couldn't quite read. Her hands were the worst of it. The blisters from the first days had broken and hardened into something tougher, but the raking motion found new places to complain about, and at night she wrapped them in old cloth she'd found in the mending basket and tried not to think too hard about the ache. She did not mention this to Caleb. He wouldn't have responded badly. She'd come to understand that about him, that his reserve was not coldness, not really, that underneath the economy of his words there was a man paying careful attention. But she didn't need his worry. She needed to be useful, which was different. One afternoon in the second week, old Tom Garrett rode up to the fence line while she was raking the far edge of the cut section. Tom Garrett ran the neighboring spread to the east, she'd been told by Henry, who had delivered this information with the particular emphasis of a child sharing gossip he doesn't entirely understand. He was in his 60s, weathered to something close to jerky, with a gray mustache and the sharp eyes of a man who had been assessing other people's situations for most of his life and finding them wanting. He stopped his horse at the fence and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You the woman Mercer hired?" "Yes." She kept raking. "You're doing field work." "I am." He was quiet for another moment. "Where are you from?" "Ohio originally, most recently Wichita." "Uh-huh." She could feel him still looking, the way you feel a draft from a bad window. "Caleb know what he's doing, hiring a woman for field work?" She stopped raking, looked at him directly. "Mr. Mercer knows what his fields need. I'd say that's his business to know." Tom Garrett looked at her for a moment longer, and then something happened at the corner of his mouth that might have been approval or might have been the beginning of disapproval, and she couldn't be sure which. He touched the brim of his hat and rode away without another word. That evening she mentioned it to Caleb briefly because she thought he should know a neighbor had been watching his operation. She described the exchange without emphasis and without asking for a reaction. Caleb's jaw moved slightly. Tom Garrett minds other people's business more than his own. Seemed that way. He give you trouble? No, he was rude. That's different from trouble. Caleb looked at her across the table. You draw a line between those two things? I draw a lot of lines, she said, and went back to eating. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. The near smile, the one she'd seen on their first day, that lived just below the surface of his face and rarely made it all the way up. Henry saw it too. She could tell because Henry tracked his father's face constantly, with the vigilance of a child who has been the main emotional barometer of a household, and when he saw it, something in his small shoulders loosened very slightly. She noticed that, filed it away. The evenings were when the silence of the ranch pressed hardest. Not an empty silence. There was always wind, always the sounds of the livestock, always the small domestic sounds of a household running, but the specific silence between adults who were being careful with each other, who had things they were circling around without being ready to approach directly. Most nights, Caleb sat at the kitchen table after Henry was in bed and worked through whatever accounting or planning needed doing, and Marin sat near the stove with the mending basket, because there was always mending. Henry's clothing had the destruction patterns of a 7-year-old's clothing everywhere, and beyond that there were Caleb's work clothes, worn hard, and curtains that were giving up along the seam lines. They didn't talk a great deal during these evenings, but they were in the same room, which was its own kind of conversation. One night, maybe 10 days in, Caleb set down his pencil and said, without preamble, "What was your father's business like in Ohio?" She looked up from the shirt she was hemming. Hardware, nails, wire, tools, lumber by order. He had it for 22 years. Did he build it himself? He bought it from a man who was failing at it and turned it around. He always said he didn't build it so much as rescue it. She paused. He had a talent for seeing what was wrong with something and fixing just that thing. Not everything, just the thing that was causing the other problems. Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. What was wrong with this place when you got here? In your assessment? The question surprised her a little. Not because it was strange, but because it was direct, in a way that she hadn't expected from him yet. You want an honest answer? I wouldn't ask otherwise. She set the shirt down. The work was getting done, the immediate work. The livestock, the field, the basic functioning. But there was no system. Everything was being responded to instead of anticipated. The pantry was managed by emergency rather than by plan. The accounts... She hesitated. The accounts had been avoided because looking at them hurt. He was looking at her steadily. That's not a criticism, she said. You were one person managing more than one person can manage. You made the choices you had to make about where the attention went. It is a criticism, though, he said. Not defensively, just accurately. A fair one. Maybe, she said, but unfair circumstances produce reasonable responses that look wrong from the outside. He picked up his pencil again, turned it in his fingers. Eleanor used to say that I fixed the things I could see and ignored the things I couldn't. It was the second time he'd mentioned Eleanor by name. She kept her face neutral and her voice steady. Was she right? Usually, he said. About most things. He set the pencil down again, a gesture of putting something away. She'd have liked you, I think. She didn't have much patience for people who talked around things. Marin felt something shift in her chest. Not uncomfortably, but with the weight of being seen somewhat clearly by someone who was still mostly a stranger. I take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. He went back to his papers. She went back to the mending. The wind worked at the window, and the stove ticked as the fire settled, and outside the Kansas dark was complete and enormous. And inside the lamp threw a circle of warmth, just big enough for two people to sit in. The thing she was trying not to examine too closely, was that it wasn't uncomfortable. It should have been uncomfortable, probably. She was a stranger in someone else's house, doing work that was beyond what she'd contracted for, sitting in someone else's kitchen while that someone else looked over his failing accounts. And none of it was what she'd planned when she'd folded that newspaper advertisement and tucked it into her boot. But it wasn't uncomfortable, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. The weather broke in the third week, and not gently. It came from the northwest on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sky had been doing something Marin now recognized as preliminary. That thick yellow-gray light that arrived before serious weather. The pressure in the air that she'd started to feel across the back of her shoulders. Caleb had looked at the sky at noon and told her they needed to bring in as much of the far section as possible before it hit, and they'd gone at it hard, him swinging and her raking and bundling with a speed that was less technique and more determination. The rain came in at about 4 o'clock. Not a disaster rain, not this time. Not the kind that could flatten standing wheat, but a cold driving thing that soaked through her coat and Eleanor's jacket underneath and turned the field into something that sucked at every step. They kept going another 20 minutes until Caleb said curtly, "House?" and she didn't argue. And she didn't. They came in through the back door, both of them dripping, and Marin went straight to the stove and started rebuilding the fire that had gone low while they'd been outside. Her hands were stiff with cold. She was making them do the work anyway. Unlatch the firebox, adjust the flue, feed kindling, and she was doing it with the focused mechanical attention of a person who knows that if they stop to think about how cold they are, they'll make it worse. Caleb was at the pump, washing the mud off his hands with water that was certainly not warm, his jaw set against the cold the same way hers was. "How much did we get in?" she asked, without turning from the stove. "Enough to make a difference. Not as much as I wanted." "When will it let up?" He looked at the window. "Tomorrow morning, probably. Maybe tonight. Then we'll see what's left standing." Henry came down the stairs in the particular clatter of a 7-year-old who has heard the back door and has opinions about what's for supper. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at both of them. Wet, muddy, Marin's hair completely undone from where it had been pinned, Caleb's beard running rivulets. "You look terrible," Henry said with the cheerful honesty of a child. "Thank you," Marin said. "Did the storm get the wheat?" "Some of it," Caleb said. Henry absorbed this with the seriousness of a child who understands, at some level, that some of the wheat is not a good answer, even if he can't do the full arithmetic on why. He looked at his father's face, doing that barometric check, and then apparently decided that the situation required a practical contribution. "I can set the table," he said. "That'd be good," Caleb said. Henry went to get plates, and Caleb and Marin looked at each other for a moment across the kitchen, both drenched, the fire finally catching behind her, the rain against the window, the small sound of Henry counting out forks. And something in the look was just briefly, just for a second, almost funny. Not funny enough to laugh at, but close. She turned back to the stove. He went to change out of his wet clothes. Henry set the table with the focused care of a child who has been given an important job, putting everything at precise right angles, which she noticed and which made something in her chest go a little sideways. After supper, after Henry was in bed, she sat at the table across from Caleb with the ranch account spread between them, and they worked out carefully what the reduced harvest would actually mean. The numbers were not comfortable, not disastrous yet. The yet was doing a lot of work in that sentence, but the margin was thinning. The land note payment was coming in December. The Harmon's credit needed to be reduced before winter closed down the ability to supplement provisions. The equipment shed roof that needed work would need to wait until spring, which was a risk but a manageable one if the winter was ordinary. "The livestock are healthy," she said. "That's not nothing. The milk cows, the hogs, the horses. If you needed to, you could sell one of the hogs this month and put that against the Harmon's account." "I don't want to slaughter early." "I didn't say slaughter, I said sell. Tom Garrett might buy." Caleb looked at her. "You want me to sell a hog to Tom Garrett. I want you to pay down the Harmon's account. Tom Garrett is a means to that end." She paused. "Unless the two of you have a history I should know about." "We don't have a history. He's just—" He stopped, drummed his fingers on the table once, twice. "He's been waiting to see this place fail since before Eleanor died. I don't like giving him the satisfaction of thinking I need to sell off stock." "He'd be buying the hog," she said. "Not the ranch. There's a difference." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working something over in his mind, the way he did when he was getting past pride toward practicality, which was a visible process in him if you knew what to watch for. "I'll think about it," he said. "All right." She gathered the papers, restacked them, put them back in the tin box. Caleb watched her do it with an expression she was learning to read as something between gratitude and discomfort, the look of a person who needs help and is not entirely comfortable needing it. "It's not charity," she said, without looking up from the papers. "Working through numbers together, it's just two people thinking about the same problem." "I know that. I know you know it. I'm just saying it out loud because sometimes it helps." He looked at her for a moment. "Does it help?" She thought about her father, about the evenings they'd spent at a similar kitchen table in Ohio, going through similar papers with a similar lamp throwing a similar circle of light, her father turning a pencil in his fingers the same way Caleb did, the two of them working a problem that neither could solve alone. "Yes," she said. "It helps." The next morning, the rain had stopped and the sky was that cold-washed blue that follows a storm, brilliant and sharp-edged, and the field damage was less than she'd feared. The rain had come sideways rather than straight down, which mattered with wheat, and most of what was still standing in a way that could be cut. Caleb walked the field first while she made breakfast, and when he came back in, his expression was better than it had been the night before. "We can finish the cut section today if the ground firms up enough by mid-morning," he said. "I'll be ready when you say." Henry was at the table eating his porridge and studying his reader for school, the book propped against the sugar bowl, his lips moving slightly with words. He did this every morning, this morning reading, and she had come to find it quietly pleasant, the small sound of a child teaching himself things. "Henry," Caleb said, and the boy looked up. "After school today, I need you in the barn. Not the field, not the yard. Barn. You hear me?" Henry's eyes went a little sharp with the attention of a child filing information. "Is something wrong with one of the animals?" "The south stall needs mucking out and I haven't had time. Can you start it?" Henry looked briefly like he wanted to negotiate, then apparently did the calculations on whether that was a winning proposition and decided it wasn't. "Yes, sir." "Good man." Henry went back to his reader. Marin put a plate in front of Caleb and went to get her own, and when she sat down, Caleb said quietly, so it didn't carry across the table, "He's been wanting to help more. I keep telling him he's too young. He's not too young for the barn work." "I know." He looked at his plate. "I keep treating him like he's still 5. "Fathers do that," she said. "Mine did it with me until I was about 12 and took over his accounts without asking, and he ran out of reasons to say I was too young." Caleb looked up at her, and there it was again, that near smile, that thing that lived just under the surface of his face. "You just took them over." "He left them on the kitchen table. That was practically an invitation." He shook his head, once, the way a person does when they're amused and trying to be dignified about it. Henry looked up from his reader at whatever shifted in the air, looked at his father, looked at Marin, and went back to reading with the focused unconcern of a child pretending not to be curious. She was at the field by mid-morning when the ground had firmed enough that the boots didn't sink. The sky stayed clear, cold, brilliant, that November close October blue that had no warmth left in it, and she raked and bundled with the rhythm she'd built over 3 weeks, the one that had stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like a thing her body just did. Caleb worked the scythe steadily down the rows ahead of her, and she followed, and the cut section grew, and the bundled wheat stacked in the field like rough-edged towers, and by mid-afternoon she could see the shape of the thing. How much was going to get done, what would remain, what the winter would bring. She didn't like all of it, the calculation, but she could see the shape of it, which was better than not being able to see. Tom Garrett rode by the fence line again at around 3. This time he looked at the field for a long moment, looked at her, looked at Caleb in the distance, and rode on without stopping. She watched him go. That evening she told Caleb she thought Garrett was reconsidering whatever opinion he'd formed about the ranch's prospects. "What makes you say that?" "The way he looked at the field. First time he was looking at what was wrong with it. This time he was looking at what was getting done." Caleb considered this. "You read people fast. My father's hardware store. You learn to read who's going to buy, and who's going to complain, and who's going to walk out. 3 different kinds of looking." "What kind does Garrett have?" "The kind that would buy a hog," she said, "if you gave him the chance to think it was his idea." There was a pause, and then Caleb said, "You might be right," which was as close to "you're right" as she'd heard from him, and she let it stand without pushing. She was learning his language, she realized, the shorthand of a person who used words sparingly and meant them precisely. I'll think about it meant I'm probably going to do it. Might be meant is. You don't have to meant I appreciate that you are. She was also learning, less comfortably, what his silences meant. The silence in the evenings that wasn't entirely about exhaustion. The way he sometimes looked at the kitchen, at the fire, the lamp, the table, with an expression she couldn't name and hadn't tried to, except that it wasn't sadness exactly, more like a man looking at something he'd forgotten how to expect. She didn't name it because naming it felt like overstepping. She was hired help, technically. She had a wage. She had a small east-facing room and a hook on the door and a jacket that had belonged to a woman 4 years dead. She said none of this to herself in any direct terms. She just felt the shape of it in the evenings when the lamp was lit and the mending was in her lap and Caleb was across the table with his pencil. And outside the Kansas dark was total and indifferent. And inside this single room, something was accumulating that neither of them had agreed to and neither of them had quite acknowledged yet. On a Thursday in the last week of October, Henry came home from school with a note from the school teacher, a young woman named Miss Pratt, who reported that Henry had gotten into a disagreement with another boy that had become physical, and would his father please speak with him regarding the incident. Caleb read the note at the table while Henry sat across from him with his arms folded and his jaw set in a look that was his father's jaw and his father's expression in miniature, right down to the deliberate stillness of a person controlling something they'd rather not control. Marin was at the stove and stayed there. "What happened?" Caleb said. Not a question. Henry's arms tightened across his chest. Eddie Harmon said something. "What did he say?" A very long pause. "He said you had a woman living in our house who wasn't family, and that meant—" Henry stopped. His jaw went tighter. "He said something rude about it." Caleb looked at Henry for a long moment. Then he looked briefly at Marin's back, then at Henry again. "What did you do?" "I told him he was wrong. He kept saying it, so I—" Another stop. "I pushed him." "Hard?" "He fell down." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You shouldn't have pushed him." "He was wrong. He was wrong and you shouldn't have pushed him. Those two things are both true at the same time, Henry." Henry's arms didn't unfold, but something around his eyes shifted. "He was saying bad things about Miss Marin." Caleb looked at his son. "I know." His voice had changed slightly, the weight in it different. "But fighting Eddie Harmon in the schoolyard isn't going to change what people say. It's just going to get you sent home with notes." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Henry asked, and there was something raw in it, the real question underneath, which was not about Eddie Harmon at all, and both of them knew it. Caleb leaned forward, put his elbows on the table. "You don't owe anybody an explanation about what happens in our house. You understand me? Not Eddie Harmon, not his father, not Tom Garrett, not anyone. What happens here is our business." Henry looked at his father. The rawness was still there, but something else was too now, something steadying. "Is Miss Marin staying?" he asked, and the way he said it was so careful, so deliberate, that it was clear he'd been holding it for a while. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to be its own kind of answer, which Marin heard from the stove and kept her back to and her face forward and did not move. "She has work here," Caleb said, "and she's doing it well." It was not what Henry had asked, exactly, but Henry looked at his father's face with those measuring eyes, and apparently what he read there was sufficient, because he unfolded his arms and put them flat on the table and said, "Okay," in the tone of someone who has decided to accept terms that are not perfect, but are workable. "You'll apologize to Eddie Harmon tomorrow," Caleb said. Henry's face went briefly through several things. "Yes, sir," he said, with the sound of someone paying a bill they don't think they owe. "Even when you're right," Caleb said, "you apologize for how you handled it, not for what you believed." Henry thought about this for a moment. "That's hard." "Yes," Caleb said. "It is." Marin stood at the stove and stirred the stew that didn't need stirring and kept her face perfectly still, because some moments needed to happen in a room without commentary from the person standing at the edges of it. Later, after Henry was in bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table and did not open the accounts. He just sat, a cup of coffee in both hands, looking at the middle distance the way he did when he was working through something internal. Marin sat across from him with the mending, the way she did. Outside the wind had an edge that was new. Not quite winter yet, but not pretending otherwise anymore. After a while, Caleb said, "The town's going to talk. Some of it's already started." "I know. It doesn't, what they say doesn't change anything for me. I want you to know that." She looked up from the mending. He was looking at his coffee, not at her. "All right," she said, "but I know it might affect how you—" He stopped, chose different words. "If it makes your situation here uncomfortable, you can say so." "It doesn't." He looked up then. "You're sure?" "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I walked 7 miles across open prairie in October because I had nowhere else to go. What Tom Garrett thinks about that is considerably less important to me than whether the milk cows get fed." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression did what it sometimes did, opened slightly, the way a room looks different when a window is cracked. The air in it changed. "Caleb," he said. She looked at him. "My name," he said. "You've been here 3 weeks. You can call me Caleb." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "Caleb." He nodded once, picked up his coffee, and looked back at the middle distance, and she looked back at the mending, and outside the Kansas dark pressed at every window, and the wind said winter was coming, and neither of them said anything else. But the thing that had been accumulating in the evenings accumulated a little more, and the room held it, and neither of them named it. Not yet. The 1st of November arrived the way bad news does, quietly, without announcing itself, just suddenly there when you looked up. Marin had been at Blackstone Ranch for 26 days. She knew this not because she was counting exactly, but because she'd been tracking provisions against the calendar in the back of the household ledger she'd started keeping, a practical record of what came in and what went out and what needed ordering before the roads got bad. 26 days meant she'd been through 2 hard rains, 1 dry stretch that had felt like a gift, and approximately 40 conversations with Duchess of Trouble about the nature of patience, none of which had made any impression on the cow whatsoever. The wheat was almost in. Not all of it. The north section that the earlier storm had flattened was a loss she'd watched Caleb absorb with the particular stillness of a man who has already done the arithmetic and doesn't need to say it out loud. But enough. Enough to meet the land note in December. Enough, if the winter provisions held and no equipment failed catastrophically, to bring the ranch to spring without additional debt. She'd written those numbers in the ledger herself, sitting at the kitchen table on the last evening of October while Caleb was in the barn checking the livestock against the dropping temperature, and she'd looked at them for a long time. Not comfortable numbers, numbers that required everything to go reasonably right, but real numbers, honest ones, and she'd found, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, that she preferred honest hard numbers to comfortable vague ones. The sky on the 1st of November looked wrong from the moment she was up. She noticed it while she was crossing the yard to the chicken coop at 4:45, that particular flatness to the darkness overhead, a thickness to the air that was different from ordinary cold. She stood in the yard for a moment with the feed bucket in her hand and looked north, where the real weather always came from in this part of Kansas, and the north was doing something she didn't have the vocabulary for yet, but that her body registered as a warning. She mentioned it to Caleb when he came down for breakfast. "The sky looks wrong." He was at the pump, and he stopped. "What kind of wrong?" "Heavy, very still, the kind of still that doesn't feel like calm." He went to the back door and opened it and stood there for about 30 seconds looking north. And when he came back inside, his expression had gone into that focused, closed-down mode she'd come to recognize as his version of alarm. He didn't panic, Caleb Mercer. She doubted he knew how. But he got very deliberate, very specific, the way a man gets when he's converting fear into a list of things that need doing. "When?" she asked. "Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning." He sat down and ate breakfast with mechanical efficiency, his eyes going to the window at intervals. "There's wheat still standing in the east section, 6, maybe 8 rows. We go now? As soon as Henry's at school." She was already untying her apron. They were in the field by 7:30, cutting and raking with a speed that had nothing graceful about it. Caleb swung the scythe with the concentrated force of a man who understands that this is not the time for technique, and Marin followed behind him and raked with her shoulders, screaming from the first hour, and kept going anyway because the sky in the north was getting thicker, and the wind had started, that low warning push that she now recognized as something the land was doing before it really committed. By 10 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 8 degrees. She knew this not from a thermometer, but from her hands, which had gone from aching to something beyond aching to a kind of determined numbness. She kept raking. The bundled wheat stacked behind her. Caleb was ahead, relentless, the scythe arc steady and hard. They didn't talk while they worked. There wasn't spare air for it. At noon, Caleb looked at the sky and then at the remaining rows and did some calculation she couldn't follow. 2 more hours, he said. Maybe less. Of time? Of weather holding. He looked at the remaining wheat. We're not going to get it all. How much do we need to get? He pointed. That section there and the 2 rows east of it. The rest, losing the rest won't break us. Losing that section will. She looked at where he was pointing, looked at the sky. Then that's where we go. They moved to the priority section and went at it with everything left. And by 1:30 in the afternoon, the wind had come up hard from the north, and the first edge of the storm was visible on the horizon. Not just cloud now, but something with structure, something moving with intention, and Marin could feel it in the air like a pressure change, like the sky was being pressed down. Marin, Caleb's voice was sharp. Enough. We get the bundles in, and we go. She looked at the rows still standing, maybe 30 feet, maybe less. I'll finish the bundling. You get the bundles on the wagon. Marin, 30 feet, Caleb. Go get the wagon. He looked at her for one long moment, and she could see him calculating whether to argue. And then apparently he decided the time spent arguing was more expensive than trusting her. And he went. She bundled with both hands, fast and rough. Not neat. Not the way she'd learned to do it. Just bound and tied and stacked. And the wind was pushing at her hard enough now that she had to lean into it. And the sky had gone that particular yellow-green that she now knew meant something serious was coming. Her hair had pulled entirely loose from its pins and was across her face, and she kept pushing it back with her forearm because her hands were full. Caleb got the wagon up to the field edge and started loading. She kept bundling. The temperature dropped again, noticeably, the kind of drop you feel in your teeth. The first sleet hit when she was on the last row. Not rain, not yet. Sleet, small and stinging, driven sideways by the wind, finding every exposed piece of skin with precision. She kept moving. The last bundle. She tied it wrong twice because her hands weren't cooperating and had to redo it, and by the time she lifted it and carried it to the wagon, the sleet had become something between sleet and snow, and the visibility to the north was about 50 yards. Caleb took the bundle from her hands without speaking. His face was wet with sleet, his beard full of it. That's all of it? She asked. That's all of it. Get up. He meant the wagon. She climbed up, and he climbed up beside her, and he moved the horses fast across the field toward the gate, and the storm came in behind them like it had been waiting. By the time they reached the barn, the full weight of it had arrived. Not the worst of it. She'd learn later that the worst was still 6 hours out. But the arrival, the declaration of intent, the wind at 40 miles an hour, and the temperature dropping toward something genuinely dangerous, and the snow coming horizontally in the kind of curtain that makes the world 10 feet wide. They got the wagon in. They got the horses in. Caleb moved through the barn with sharp efficiency, closing the stall doors, checking the livestock, looking at the barn roof with the critical eye of a man who has cataloged every structural weakness in his property and is now running the tally against incoming conditions. Henry, Marin said. It came out before she'd fully processed the thought. Caleb was already moving. I know. He'll have kept at the schoolhouse. Miss Pratt knows better than to send them home in this, but I need to... Go, she said. I'll secure the barn and the yard. What needs doing here? He looked at her. Sleet was still melting in his hair on his beard. His eyes were doing that rapid assessment thing. The south stall gate needs a crossbar, or the wind will take it. The feed store in the east corner needs the tarp weighted down. There are supply crates on the south side of the yard that need to get under cover. I'll handle it. Go get Henry. He went, and she turned to the barn. She worked for the next 2 hours in conditions that she did not like to think about clearly while they were happening. The wind in the barn was bearable, so the structure cut most of it. But every time she went into the yard for the supply crates, she was dealing with near zero visibility and cold that was no longer merely uncomfortable, but was in a category she had no previous personal experience of. She moved the crates by feel as much as sight, stacking them against the barn wall. She got the tarp weighted with the stones Caleb had indicated. She found the crossbar for the south stall gate after an uncomfortable 5 minutes of looking in the wrong place and got it into position while the gate tried to fight her. Her fingers stopped working properly somewhere in the middle of all this. Not stopped entirely. She could still make them grip and move, but the fine motor cooperation was gone, and she was doing everything by the gross effort of hands that weren't quite hers anymore. She thought about this in a peripheral, observational way and kept working. Caleb came back with Henry at a little past 3 in the afternoon, both of them snow white from the collar up, Henry's small face pinched and red with cold. He had one hand gripping his father's coat sleeve and was leaning into Caleb's side with the instinctive, unself-conscious seeking of shelter that small children do and pretend they're not doing. Maren was in the barn when they came through the door, and Henry looked at her, at the state of her, the coat heavy with snow, the hands she was holding carefully because they hurt in a way that was going to get worse, and his eyes went wide. "What happened to your hands?" he said. "Cold," she said. "I need to warm them up slowly. Don't worry about it." "That's what Pa says when he doesn't want me to worry," Henry said, "and it always means I should worry." Caleb was looking at her hands with an expression she couldn't read because she was focused on not making a face about them. He crossed the barn in about 4 strides and took both her hands in his, just took them, without asking, cupping them between his palms. And the warmth of it was so sudden and so sharp that she made an involuntary sound and immediately regretted it. "How long were you outside?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. Long enough." "The crates?" "Stacked against the east wall, the tarps weighted. The south gate has the crossbar." He was looking at her hands, not at her face. His hands around hers were large and rough and very warm, and she was trying to be matter-of-fact about this and finding it harder than it should have been. "You should have come inside," he said. "Someone had to do it." "I would have. You were getting Henry." She pulled her hands back gently because she could feel them again now, which was progress, and because she needed to be able to think clearly. "The barn's secured. The yard's as good as it can be. What else needs doing before the full storm hits?" He looked at her for a moment with something complex moving through his expression. Then he shifted into the deliberate, practical mode she knew. "House," he said. "We need to check the window seals and get the water situation sorted before the pump freezes. Firewood needs to be brought in and stacked inside." "I'll take the firewood. Henry can help." Henry, who had been watching all of this with the alert, careful attention he brought to everything involving the adults in his life, straightened slightly at the mention of his name. "I can carry the big pieces," he said, with dignity. "I know you can," she said. They worked the rest of the afternoon in that wordless coordination that had developed between her and Caleb over the past 4 weeks, each of them taking a piece of the problem, checking in through look and brief word rather than extended discussion. Henry carried firewood with genuine commitment, hauling pieces nearly as big as himself in a display of determined effort that she watched from the corner of her eye and did not comment on because he was clearly doing it partly for an audience, and the best response to that was to act like she wasn't one. The storm fully arrived at 6 in the evening. She knew it arrived because the house, which had been shuddering at intervals in the heavy gusts, suddenly went into a sustained shudder that was different. Not a gust, but a constant pressure, like the whole building was leaning against something that was pushing back. The windows flexed, the lamp flames bent sideways in the drafts coming through the window seals despite the cloth she'd stuffed into the gaps. The sound of it was not like the wind she'd known before, not like Ohio's storms, or even like the Kansas rainstorms she'd come to recognize. It was something foundational, a noise that came from everywhere at once and seemed to get inside her chest and do something to her breathing. She was at the stove making the supper she'd planned out that afternoon in the gaps of work. A proper beef stew, with the last of the November provisions she'd been saving, because if there was ever a night for a real meal, this was it. Henry was at the table with Captain the Wooden Horse, making him walk across the tablecloth in a circuit that he'd been repeating for about 20 minutes with the self-sufficient focus of a child who has long practice at entertaining himself. Caleb came in from checking the back of the house. He'd been going around every half hour, checking for anything the wind was getting into, and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "The barn is holding." "Good. I'll go out again in an hour." "I'll go with you." He looked at her. "You don't have to, Caleb." She said his name with enough flatness to make the point without making an argument of it. He had stopped trying to tell her she didn't have to do things about 10 days ago, mostly, but weather like this brought the instinct back. "I'll go with you." He said nothing, which meant yes. They ate supper with the storm pressing at every side of the house, and Henry ate with the particular appetite of a child who has been cold and is now warm and sitting next to a bowl of beef stew, and Caleb ate with the attention of a man keeping one ear on the house around him while trying to be present at his own table. Marin ate and listened to the storm and thought about what needed doing in what order, the way she'd been thinking since she walked through the gate of this ranch 26 days ago. Somewhere in the middle of supper, the power of the wind changed again. She felt it before she heard it, a shift in the pressure, in the quality of the sound, the house moving slightly differently under the gust. Caleb put down his fork. "What was that?" Henry asked, because he'd felt it too. "Nothing," Caleb said, and stood up and went to the window. "Pa," Henry said, in the tone of a child calling out the second time he was told something wasn't something. "Just the storm settling in," Caleb said, looking out the window into the darkness that was complete now, the snow and the night having merged into a single solid thing. He could see nothing, but he kept looking. "It's all right, Henry." Marin watched Caleb's back. She could read the set of his shoulders well enough by now. The thing she was seeing there was not "it's all right." After supper, after Henry was in bed, a negotiated surrender because he didn't want to go and said so with considerable eloquence about his ability to be helpful before Caleb's expression made the decision final. They put on their coats and went out to check the barn. The force of the wind when she opened the back door was enough that she grabbed the door frame with one hand as a reflex. Not because she would have fallen, just the body's instinctive response to that much pressure from an unexpected direction. Caleb was already out and turned to look at her with the lamp in his hand, the flame somehow surviving inside the glass despite the storm's best efforts. They crossed the yard with their heads down and their shoulders into the wind, and she could feel the cold through the coat and Eleanor's jacket and everything underneath in a way that was not gradual but immediate, the kind of cold that has an opinion about you. The snow was 5 inches down already and coming fast, and each step broke through a crust of ice on top and into the softer snow below, which made the walking unstable. The barn door required both of them to open against the wind and both of them to pull shut behind them. And then they were inside and the noise dropped by half, which felt like silence even though it wasn't. The livestock were unsettled. She could tell that immediately. The particular sound of animals that are not in distress but are very much aware that something is happening and don't care for it. Duchess of Trouble was stating her views about the situation in a low, continuous complaint. The horses were moving in their stalls, not panicking, but alert. Caleb went through each stall methodically, checking, speaking low to the animals, his voice different with them than it was with people, quieter, slower, the guard he kept up around human interaction largely absent. She watched him with the brown cow for a moment, the way his hand settled on her flank and stayed, the way his voice went somewhere between instructive and just simply there. She checked the water troughs. Not frozen yet, but getting there. She found the spare hay Caleb had moved in that morning and made sure it was accessible. She found a place where the wind was getting through a gap in the east wall, the cold air a needle against her face when she walked past it, and called to Caleb. He came over and looked at it and said a word under his breath that was not polite. "I've got that gap patched twice this year," he said. "The board keeps going." "Do you have material?" "Yes." "Not ideal material, but—" He was already moving to the tool corner. "Hold the lamp." She held the lamp while he worked, the wind finding the gap and finding also every other small weakness in the barn wall with the commitment of something that didn't have anything else to do tonight. He worked fast, but the cold had got into his hands too, and she could see the deliberateness of it, the extra effort that cold hands and good dexterity require. "I can hold it," she said, when he was trying to position the board and drive the nail simultaneously with only 2 hands. "It's going to the nail—" "I can hold it." She took the board from him with both hands and pressed it flat against the wall over the gap. The cold came through it immediately, into her palms. "Go!" He drove 3 nails in fast, and the board held, and the needle of wind went away. He looked at the repair, looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was wind-raw, and his breath was visible in the cold air, and his expression was the one she'd been trying to name for 4 weeks, the one that opened slightly when he stopped thinking about opening it. You didn't have to hold that, he said. I know. She handed him the lamp. They stood there in the barn with the storm outside and the animals restless around them and the lamp casting its circle between them. And he looked at her with that expression, and she looked back, and neither of them said what was in the room between them, because the room between them had been holding it for 4 weeks and could hold it a little longer. But it was there. It was absolutely there, and both of them knew it. We should go back in, she said. Yes. Neither of them moved immediately. Then Caleb said, Thank you. For today. For all of it. I work here, she said, which was what she said when the thanks felt like too much, the deflection she used when she didn't know what to do with being seen. Marin. The way he said her name, the 2 syllables of it, the particular weight he gave it, saying it right the same way Henry had on the first day. You didn't have to stay out there as long as you did. You didn't have to secure the yard by yourself. You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to, she said, and her voice came out a little rougher than she'd intended. I wanted to. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. The storm pressed at the barn. Duchess of Trouble voiced a complaint. I know there's a difference, he said finally. That's why I said thank you. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp flame held steady between them for once, the barn giving it enough shelter to burn without leaning. You're welcome, she said, and meant it completely, without deflection. They went back through the storm to the house, bent into the wind, and she couldn't see the house until they were nearly at the back door, the snow and the dark complete around them, and for the length of that crossing she could only tell where Caleb was by the moving point of the lamp in his hand, a small, steady light in the middle of all that weather. She fixed that in her mind, that image, without knowing why. The storm raged through the night and into the next morning. She didn't sleep well, not because of fear exactly, but because the sound of it kept changing, finding new registers, and her mind wouldn't fully let go of the list of things that could go wrong. She was up twice to check the fire, and the second time she sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while, just listening to the house hold itself together around her. She thought about the east-facing room, the faded blue curtains, the small iron stove. She thought about the hook on the back of the door where her second dress hung. She thought about the tin box of accounts, and the household ledger she'd started keeping, and the chicken coop, and Duchess of Trouble, and the way Henry said Miss Marin with the same particular emphasis, whether he was asking a question or making a complaint, or occasionally telling her something he thought she should know. She thought about a man going through the barn stalls, speaking low to animals in the dark. She sat in the kitchen in the dark and let herself understand, slowly and without ceremony, that what she'd walked toward at the end of a dirt road in October was no longer something she could describe as just a job. She did not know what to do with that understanding. She just let it exist, the way you let a candle burn without putting it out, even when you're not sure what you lit it for. Outside the storm continued its work, indifferent and enormous, and inside Blackstone Ranch the house held and the fire held, and everything that had been accumulating in the evening sat in the kitchen around her like a second presence, patient and waiting and absolutely real. The storm took 2 days to finish its business. When it was finally done, when the wind dropped to something ordinary and the snow stopped falling and the sky went to that hard, clean blue that follows serious weather, Blackstone Ranch was buried under 14 inches of snow, and a silence so complete it felt almost aggressive after 36 hours of the alternative. Marin stood on the back porch that second morning with a cup of coffee and looked at what the storm had left. The yard had been reshaped, familiar landmarks softened into white curves she had to interpret rather than simply read. The fence line along the north field had disappeared under a drift that came up to her chest in places. The supply crates she'd stacked against the barn wall, still there, still stacked, just white on top. The barn itself stood solid, no visible damage from here, and that was the first thing she'd checked when she'd opened the back door. She heard the creak of the floor behind her, and then Caleb was at the door looking past her at the yard. "Barn's all right?" he asked. "Looks like it from here. I haven't been out yet." He came out onto the porch in his coat, coffee in hand, and stood beside her. Not close. There was a foot of distance and the particular careful spacing of 2 people who have been managing their proximity with some deliberateness. But beside her, both of them looking at the same white expanse. "The east section," he said. "I know." She'd been thinking about it since she woke up. The wheat they hadn't gotten to. The rows they'd decided to sacrifice when they'd prioritized the middle section. She'd been running the numbers in her head the way she'd taken to doing, the habit having settled in over the past weeks. How much of the standing section do you think survived? Depends on how it fell. If it went flat instead of breaking, he looked at the north horizon, which was clear now, brutally clear. Maybe some of it's salvageable, after the snow melts enough to get out there. Yes. They drank their coffee. The silence that had replaced the storm was doing something to the air between them, she thought, stripping away the noise that had kept things at a certain managed distance. There was nowhere to put your attention out here now, except the immediate, the real, the thing actually in front of you. I kept thinking about the barn roof, Caleb said after a while. The patch on the east side. Did it hold? I need to look. He set his coffee down on the porch rail. I'll go now. I'll come. He looked at her sideways. Not arguing, just confirming, the way he did now. The look that meant, I heard you, you're sure. All right then. She'd stopped noticing when the dynamic between them had shifted from him questioning whether she meant what she said to him, simply accepting that she did. It had happened somewhere in the middle weeks, and she hadn't marked it at the time, but she was aware of it now. The barn was fine. The patch had held, the roof was intact, and the animals had come through with the particular indignant energy of livestock that have been confined and are ready to voice opinions about it. Duchess of Trouble had several. Marin listened to them with the resigned sympathy she'd developed for the cow over the past weeks. Genuine understanding was still not on the table, but she'd arrived at a kind of respectful coexistence that she counted as progress. What was not fine was the fence line on the north perimeter. The weight of the snow had come down on a section of it that had been marginal before the storm. The 3 posts she'd noticed needed replacing in her first week, and 2 of them had gone over, taking about 30 feet of fencing with them. Caleb stood at the edge of the collapsed section with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at it for a long time. I can see the other side of your face from here, she said, because she could. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Posts have been bad since August. I kept saying I'd get to it. He crouched down and pulled at one of the downed posts, which came up with no resistance. The base rotted through. I knew this was going to go. We fix it before the livestock figure out it's gone. Yes. He stood up. I've got posts in the equipment shed. It's going to take most of today. Then let's start. She looked at the downed fence. I can dig the post holes if you show me the placement. He looked at her. A look she'd learned to parse now, the one that was working through whether to say something or to let it go. He let it go. Ground's going to be hard. I assumed. The post hole digging was, objectively speaking, the hardest single physical thing she had done at Blackstone Ranch, which was setting a high bar. The top layer of snow moved easily enough, but under it, the freeze had already worked into the earth, and each hole required breaking through that crust before she could get into soil that was merely cold and resistant rather than actively hostile. Caleb worked the other end of the fence line, setting the post she'd dug for while she moved to the next position, and they worked toward each other through the morning in the cold that was real now. Not October pretending to be winter, but actual November, doing what November in Kansas does. Henry came out at mid-morning in every article of clothing he owned, by the look of it, and stood at the edge of the work and watched for approximately 4 minutes before the stillness became intolerable. I can hold the post, he said to his father. Caleb looked at him. You'll hold it steady? Yes. Both hands. Don't let go when I'm driving it. Henry's chin went up. I know, Pa. He held the posts. He held them well, actually. Stood absolutely square and gripped with both hands, and kept his face turned away from the impact the way Caleb told him to, and didn't flinch or let go. Caleb drove the posts without comment on this, which was its own kind of comment, and Henry received it with the quiet satisfaction of a child who has been taken seriously. By noon, the fence was back up. Not pretty, not perfectly straight on the center post, but solid and functional and adequate for keeping livestock where they were supposed to be. Marin stepped back from the last wire and looked at it. It'll hold, she said. Until spring, Caleb said. Then I need to do this whole section properly. He looked at the fence line, and she could see him doing what he'd been doing more lately, looking at the ranch's deficiencies without the particular flatness that used to accompany that assessment, planning forward rather than just noting problems. I want to extend this fence line another 20 yards east. Expand the grazing section. That's doable in spring, before the planting. He looked at her. You're already planning spring? She almost said someone has to, but that was deflection, which she'd been trying to use less. Yes, she said simply. I am. Something shifted in his expression. He looked at the fence, then at the snowed field beyond, then back at her, and there was something in his face she recognized now as what happened when he was dealing with something he hadn't prepared a response to. He nodded once and picked up his tools, and she picked up hers, and Henry was already halfway back to the house, making large, deliberate footprints in the snow and apparently narrating something to himself in a low, running voice. That afternoon, while Henry was at the table working through a page of arithmetic with the grim determination of a child who dislikes arithmetic and is not going to say so, Marin sat with the household ledger and ran the numbers on the storm's full impact. She'd been doing it in pieces since the morning, fitting the picture together. The wheat they'd managed to save, the wheat that was lost, the fence repair cost against what they had, the provisions situation as winter settled in properly. She worked for an hour. At the end of that hour, she had a clear picture, and the picture was better than she'd feared. Not comfortable. She wasn't going to describe it as comfortable because it required things to go right in a way that didn't allow for much variance, and life had a way of not respecting the plans you laid for it. But the land note could be met in December. The Harmons' account could be serviced through the winter if they were careful with provisions. The spring, if the winter was ordinary, was genuinely workable. She sat with this for a while. Then she thought about what had brought her to this table in the first place. The 4 lines of newsprint in her boot, the 7 miles of prairie, the desperate arithmetic of a woman with $2.40 and nowhere else to go. She thought about what she'd expected when she'd walked through the stone-propped gate. A job, temporary shelter, breathing room. A way to stop the immediate fall before she figured out the next thing. She had not expected to become necessary. She had not expected to start planning someone else's spring. She closed the ledger. Caleb came in from the barn where he'd been doing the afternoon check, stomping snow from his boots at the door, and looked at her at the table. Numbers? He asked. Better than I thought they'd be. He came over and she showed him, walking through it the way she'd learned to. Not just delivering the result, but showing the path. Because he was better with the accounting now, better at reading what the numbers meant rather than just what they said. He leaned over the table and followed her finger across the columns, and she could feel the warmth of him close beside her and did not remark on it. The December payment, he said. We can make it. Yes, if nothing breaks. Something always breaks. Something always breaks, she agreed. I've left a contingency. Small, but it's there. He straightened and looked at the ledger rather than at her, and she could see him absorbing not just the numbers, but what the numbers represented. A version of this ranch's future that was different from the one he'd been carrying around in his head for 4 years. A version that was tight and difficult and uncertain, but was not demonstrably failing. Tom Garrett came by yesterday, he said, while you were in the barn. She looked up. Came by during the storm? Just after it broke. He was checking his own fence line on the east perimeter, came up to the gate. Caleb paused. He said he'd heard from Harmon about the harvest, what we'd gotten in. What did Harmon say? That we'd gotten more in than he'd expected? Given. He stopped. Given everything. She understood the given everything. Given that Caleb had been running the operation short-handed, given the storms, given the general opinion in Dalton Creek that Blackstone Ranch had been in decline since Eleanor. What did Garrett say? She asked. He said, Caleb's jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was choosing words with care. He said, whoever's been keeping your books doesn't know what they don't know, which is the best kind of bookkeeper, meaning they're not making complicated what doesn't need to be. Marin looked at him. That's almost a compliment. From Tom Garrett, that's a standing ovation. The near smile, unmistakable. He also asked if I wanted to sell a hog. She sat very still. What did you say? I said I'd consider it. He looked at her with something that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. You were right about him wanting to think it was his idea. Did he come to a number? Fair one. Better than I expected. He paused. I said I'd talk it over and send word. Then yes, she said. Sell the hog, put it against the Harmon account before Christmas. Yes, he said, and the word carried the sound of a man who has been convinced of something he was already partly convinced of and just needed the confirmation. He sat down across from her, not to look at the ledger. He'd already absorbed what he needed from it. He sat the way people sit when they intend to stay in a conversation. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The east-facing room." He said it carefully. "When I showed it to you the first day, I said it was small." "You did." "I didn't ask if it was enough." "It's enough," she said. "I'm not asking now if it's enough," he said. I'm asking if it's what you want. Ongoing." He was looking at the table, not at her, which was how he handled things he didn't know the architecture of. "You've been here 5 weeks. You haven't said anything about leaving, about what's next. And I haven't asked because He stopped. "I didn't want to ask." "Why not?" He looked up. "Because I didn't want to give you the idea that I was looking for a reason to let you go. And I didn't want to know the answer if it was the wrong one." The kitchen was very quiet. Henry had finished his arithmetic page and was drawing something on the back of it with total concentration, his tongue touching his upper lip the way it did when he was committed to a task. "What would the wrong answer be?" she asked. Caleb looked at her steadily. "You know what it would be." She did. She looked at her hands on the ledger, the hands that had blistered and hardened and gotten stronger over 5 weeks of ranch work, that had driven fence posts and bundled wheat and milked cows and held barn boards flat against Kansas wind. Hands that looked different than they had when she'd walked through the gate. Hands that had been doing work that mattered. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. "That's not what I'm asking," he said, with enough gentleness that it landed differently than it might have. "I know you don't have somewhere to go. That's not a good enough reason to stay somewhere." He paused. "I need to know if here is something you want, or if it's just something that's available." She opened her mouth and then closed it, because the honest answer required more courage than she'd been asked for since she'd walked out of her aunt's kitchen in Wichita with $1 from Delia and a door that hadn't opened to see her off. "I started planning your spring," she said. "I told you that this afternoon, and you noticed it, and I didn't explain what I meant by it." He waited. "I meant that somewhere in the last 5 weeks this stopped being the place I was staying and started being the place I was thinking about." She kept her voice even. "The fence extension in spring, the pantry system, the way the south field should rotate next year. I've been thinking about this place in the future tense, in the first person." She stopped. That happened without me deciding to let it happen. Caleb was very still across the table. "So the answer to your question," she said, "is that I don't know how to want somewhere I've never wanted somewhere before. But I think this is what it feels like." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she became aware of Henry at the other end of the table, who had stopped drawing and was watching both of them with the wide, careful eyes of a child who understands more about what is happening in a room than the adults in it think he does. "Pa," Henry said. Caleb looked at him. "Is Miss Marin going to stay?" Henry asked. He said it the same way he'd said it before, that same careful, deliberate wait. Except this time he said it to his father's face, directly, without deflection. Caleb looked at his son, then at Marin, then at the table. "I hope so," he said. "That's up to Miss Marin." Henry turned to Marin with the frank, uncomplicated directness of a 7-year-old who has decided that adults move too slowly on important questions. "Do you want to stay?" She looked at this small boy with his father's jaw and his careful eyes, and captained the wooden horse tucked under one arm, who had eaten her food and told her about his mother's yellow flowers, and held fence posts steady and carried firewood nearly as big as himself, and asked the question that everyone else had been walking around for weeks. "Yes," she said, "I want to stay." "I want to—" Henry looked at his father with an expression that said quite clearly that this had not been complicated, and that the adults should have sorted it out sooner. He went back to his drawing. Caleb exhaled. Not dramatically, not the release of a held breath in the way of stories, just a quiet, unremarkable exhale that was the sound of a man setting something down that he'd been carrying. He looked at the ledger. He looked at his hands. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "The room is too small." She blinked. "I told you it was fine." The bed is narrow and the iron stove takes half an hour to warm the room in the morning and the window latch doesn't seat properly. I've been meaning to fix it since September. He said this to the table, not to her, in the tone of a man reciting a list of failures he's been accounting for. If you're staying properly, the room should be better than it is. She looked at him. There was something in this that she understood. The way he expressed things through practical inventory, through what needed fixing rather than what he felt about the fixing. She had learned to read this about him, the language underneath the language. Fix the window latch, she said. The rest is fine. His eyes came up. You said fine again. Because it is. The room is small, and I've lived in smaller. She held his gaze. The important things about the room are fine. He held her gaze back, and neither of them looked away. And the kitchen held that for a moment, the two of them looking at each other across the household ledger and the remains of afternoon light with the full weight of 5 weeks of accumulated things that had finally been said. It was Henry who broke it, without looking up from his drawing. I drew the fence, he announced, and the barn, and Captain's standing on top of the barn, which he can do because he's a special horse. That's a reasonable use of Captain's abilities, Marin said. Can I show you? Yes. He brought the drawing over and she looked at it with real attention. The fence was recognizably fence-like, the barn a heroic square with a triangle on top, and Captain was indeed on the roof, 4 legs planted, head up, in a posture of complete authority. Caleb leaned over from his side of the table to look at it too, and Henry stood between them explaining his artistic choices with the confident thoroughness of a person whose work does not suffer from a lack of self-belief. That evening, after Henry was in bed, Caleb fixed the window latch. She was in the east-facing room doing the last of the day's mending when she heard his boots on the stairs, and then the knock on the open door frame. He always knocked even when the door was open. She'd noticed that about him. And when she said, "Come in," he came in with a small metal tool and crouched at the window and examined the latch. It took him about 10 minutes. She kept her eyes on the mending and listened to the small sounds of the work. The scrape of metal, a quiet word under his breath when something didn't cooperate, the final solid click of the latch, seating correctly. He stood up and tested it twice. "That'll hold now," he said. "Thank you." He looked at the room, the faded blue curtains, the narrow bed, the hook on the door where her second dress hung, the small iron stove in the corner. He looked at it the way she'd found him looking at the kitchen sometimes, at the house, at the small domestic evidence of a life being lived in a place that had been only surviving for a long time. "Eleanor chose those curtains," he said, about the blue fabric. Not painfully, in the way of someone stating a fact they've made their peace with mostly. She said the room faced east, so it needed morning-colored curtains. She was right, Marin said. He looked at her. "I think so too." He said goodnight and left, and she heard his boots going down the hall, and then the sound of his own door. She set the mending down in her lap and looked at the faded blue curtains, which were still exactly what Eleanor had chosen them to be. Morning-colored, east-facing, letting in whatever light there was. She thought about the woman who had chosen them. Thought about what it meant to be in a room that another woman had made deliberate choices about, in a house that another woman had kept, and a life she had built and left behind when she hadn't intended to. She didn't feel, as she sometimes had in the early weeks, like a trespasser. What she felt was more complicated and more honest, like someone who had arrived at a place that had been waiting for occupancy and was trying, carefully, to be worthy of it. She was not Eleanor. She was not trying to be Eleanor. Caleb was not asking her to be, had never once, in 5 weeks, compared or implied or looked at her with the particular unfair expectation that some people put on the people who come after. He missed Eleanor in the way she missed her father, silently, specifically, without requiring the present to carry the weight of it. That, she thought, was something worth knowing about a person. Outside the window, the Kansas dark was full, and the snow on the ground made the night slightly lighter than it would have been otherwise, a faint white reflection of the stars. The window latch held. The curtains hung still and faded and exactly right for the direction they faced. She thought about what she'd said at the kitchen table. "I started planning your spring," and then corrected herself privately, in the dark. "Not your spring." That had been the careful version, the hedge, the hand held partially back from the table. She had been planning the spring, the ranch's spring. Their spring, plural, the word that she hadn't said yet, but that had been forming in the back of her thinking for 2 weeks, maybe longer, in the way that real things form before you're ready to speak them aloud. She picked up the mending. She worked for another hour in the lamplight, and the house was quiet and solid around her, and the fixed latch held the cold out. And somewhere in the rooms around her, 2 other people were sleeping and would be there in the morning. And that fact, simple and unremarkable and previously unavailable to her, felt like something she was not going to take for granted. Not for a long time. Not maybe ever. December came in without apology. The land note payment went to the bank in Dalton Creek on the 14th of the month, delivered by Caleb in person on a gray Tuesday morning while Marin stayed at the ranch and made bread and tried not to watch the clock. He came back in the early afternoon with a receipt and a look on his face that was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than happiness. The expression of a man who has satisfied an obligation he wasn't sure he could satisfy, and has therefore proven to himself something he needed to know. He set the receipt to on the kitchen table. She looked at it. He poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked and sat down. "Harmon's next," he said. "After the hog sale, we're closer than you think." Tom Garrett had bought the hog the previous week, and the transaction had gone exactly as she'd predicted. Garrett had presented it as his own initiative, had named a fair price, and had accepted Caleb's counter without much resistance. They'd shaken hands at the fence line, and if Garrett had looked at Marin, who was standing 20 feet back doing something deliberate with a fence tool, with a somewhat revised expression on his face, neither she nor Caleb remarked on it afterward. Now Caleb wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the receipt and then at her. "I've been thinking," he said, which she'd learned was how he opened conversations he'd been rehearsing. "All right. The spring work, the fence extension, the north field rotation." He paused. "The things you've been planning." "Yes. I want to talk through whether the labor situation makes sense, whether we need to think differently about the arrangement here." She looked at him carefully, because arrangement was a word that could mean several things, and she wanted to know which one. What kind of differently? He was looking at the receipt rather than at her, which meant this was the part he'd rehearsed least. "The wage situation," he said. $1.50 a week. That's what we agreed." "Yes. It's not—" He stopped. Started again. "What you've been doing here isn't hired hand work anymore. It hasn't been for a while. The accounts, the planning, You built the winter provision system from nothing. You reorganized the feed schedule in the barn. You're the reason the December payment happened." She was quiet, letting him get to wherever this was going. "I can't pay you what that's worth," he said flatly, which was honesty she respected. "Not in wages, not this year, maybe not next year." He finally looked up. "But I'm not willing to keep calling it a wage arrangement when it isn't one anymore. Because that's—" He set his jaw. "Because that's not honest about what this is." The kitchen held that for a moment. "What is it?" she asked. Not challenging, asking. He looked at her with the expression she'd been watching develop for 6 weeks, the one that had started as armor and become something else. "I think you know what it is," he said. "I think you've known longer than I have, and I've been slow, and I'm sorry for that." She had not expected the apology. It landed differently than she'd expected anything to land. "You weren't slow," she said. "You were careful. Those aren't the same thing." "Marin!" He said her name with the weight he'd been giving it since that night in the barn. "I'm asking you to stay. Not as hired help. I'm asking you to stay as someone who has a stake in this place, who has a claim here." He paused. "I'm asking badly. I know I'm asking badly." "You're asking honestly," she said. "That's better than asking well." He looked at her. There was nothing managed in his expression now, no armor, none of the careful reserve she'd first met on that porch in October. He looked like what he was. A man who had been alone for 4 years and had stopped believing that would change, and was now, with considerable difficulty, updating that belief in real time. "I haven't done this before," he said. "This particular conversation. Eleanor and we grew up neighboring each other. We knew each other most of our lives before It was different. I don't know how to—" "Caleb," she said, "you just did it." He blinked. "You asked," she said. "That was the conversation. The rest is just answering." She looked at him across the table, across the coffee cups and the land note receipt and 6 weeks of Kansas winter and everything they'd built in it. I'm not going anywhere. That's my answer. I haven't been going anywhere since the second week. If you want the true timeline. Something moved through his face. Relief, and something bigger than relief that didn't have a clean name. The second week, he said. The night with the tin box and the accounts. I went to bed knowing I wasn't going to leave. She paused. It took me considerably longer to understand why. He was quiet for a moment. What made you understand why? She thought about the night of the storm, sitting in the dark kitchen while the weather raged, the candles she'd let keep burning. The storm, she said. When I came down in the middle of the night and sat in the kitchen, I let myself look at what I was afraid to look at. Which was? That I'd stopped being a person passing through and started being a person who lived somewhere. She said it straightforwardly without dressing it. That's harder than it sounds when you've spent a while being the person who doesn't belong anywhere. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and let him, and that was the whole of it. No grand gesture, no speech with the right words in the right order, just two people at a kitchen table in December with their hands around each other's and the land note receipt between the coffee cups. It wasn't a scene from a story. It was just true. They told Henry that evening after supper, or rather, they sat down with him and began to explain, and discovered approximately 45 seconds in that Henry had very little to be told. He listened to his father's careful opening sentences with the expression of a person being informed of something they filed away weeks ago, and when Caleb paused, Henry said, "So, Miss Marin's staying for real now?" in a tone that clearly implied the alternative had not been on his list of working possibilities for some time. "Yes," Caleb said. "Okay." Henry picked up his fork. Then he looked at Marin. "Are you going to change anything about the food? What specifically are you worried about?" "The biscuits. The biscuits will remain the same." He considered this. "Okay," he said again, and resumed eating with complete equanimity, which was either a child's remarkable capacity for acceptance or evidence that he'd been managing his expectations about this conversation for long enough to have worked through the feelings in advance. Probably, she thought, both. Later, when Henry was supposedly asleep and she was putting out the kitchen lamp, she heard small feet on the stairs and then Henry's voice from the doorway. "Miss Marin!" She turned around. He was standing there in his nightshirt with Captain in one hand and the serious expression he wore when he'd thought something through. "Yes?" "You know how I said I don't remember my mom much?" "I remember. I remember some things," he said. "Not a lot, but some." He looked at Captain. "I don't think she'd mind. About you staying." He said it carefully, like he'd considered it from several angles. She liked yellow things, and she didn't like people who talked around things. You don't talk around things. She stood very still in the kitchen doorway. "No," she said, when she was sure her voice was going to be level. "I try not to." He nodded, satisfied, like he'd delivered an important report, and it had been received. "Good night." "Good night, Henry." He went back up the stairs, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the lamp and did not cry, which she considered a creditable achievement under the circumstances. The winter was not easy. She hadn't expected it to be. The weeks between December and February were the particular hard months of a Kansas homestead. The cold unrelenting, the days short, the work reduced in scope but not in weight. The livestock needed daily attention. The provisions needed managing against the calendar with care. The house needed the constant small maintenance that cold demands of structures. The fire kept, the drafts addressed, the water situation monitored against the freeze. She and Caleb worked through it the way they worked through everything, in that wordless coordination that had become their natural register, each of them knowing the other's tasks well enough to compensate when one needed it, which happened regularly in both directions. She was sick for a week in January, genuinely ill, the kind of sick that keeps you horizontal and has opinions about it. And it was Caleb who managed the kitchen and the barn, both without complaint, and appeared twice a day in the doorway of the east-facing room with soup she hadn't asked for, setting it on the chair beside the bed and leaving without requiring her to be gracious about receiving it. "You don't have to," she said on the second day, which was perhaps the last time she used that particular phrase with him, and she used it knowing it. "I know." he said, and left. She recovered. February moved toward March, and March made its tentative, unreliable announcements about spring, and the land started showing through the snow in patches. And Caleb began talking about the fence extension in the specific terms of a man who has a plan and is impatient to begin it. Tom Garrett came by in March. He rode up to the gate, the properly functioning gate, latch repaired, no longer propped with a stone. On a clear afternoon when Marin was in the yard assessing the South Garden plot she'd been planning to expand for summer vegetables. She'd seen him twice over the winter, brief encounters at the fence line, and each time his manner had been incrementally less like assessment and more like ordinary acknowledgement. People revised themselves slowly, in her experience, and you had to give them time to do it on their own terms, or it didn't take. He got down from his horse and came to the gate and looked at the yard. She watched him look. The repaired fence, the organized supply storage along the barn wall, the fresh-patched barn roof, the garden plot she was measuring out. He looked at all of it with the slow, comprehensive gaze of a man who spent a lot of time evaluating other people's operations. "Mercer around?" he asked. "In the equipment shed. I can get him." "No need." He looked at the garden plot. "You're putting that in for spring?" "Summer vegetables, tomatoes, squash, beans. We've been buying them preserved, and it's an unnecessary expense when there's ground for it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's good thinking." "Thank you." Another pause. He was working up to something. She could tell, had learned to read the pauses of Dalton Creek's residents over the winter, the rhythms of people who said what they meant, but not always in a direct line toward it. "The ranch looks different than it did in the fall," he said. "It's had work done." "More than that." He looked at the house. The straightened porch rail Caleb had finally fixed in February, the functional shutters, the replaced glass in the upper window. "It looks like a place someone's taking care of." She met his eyes. "Someone is." He looked at her for a moment, the long assessing look she'd first received from him at the fence line in October, except this time it landed differently. "Harmon says you cleared the credit account." "Last month." He nodded. "That's good for Caleb. He's been—" He stopped, chose. "He's been carrying a lot. Since Eleanor." "I know." "She was a capable woman," Garrett said. "Not as comparison, not as challenge, just as fact, offered plainly." "By every account I've heard," Marin said. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." He looked at her for another moment, and whatever final revision he'd been making to his opinion completed itself in that look. He touched his hat. "Tell Mercer I'll have the post materials he ordered at my place by Friday." "I'll tell him." He got back on his horse and rode east along the fence line, and she watched him go and then went back to measuring the garden plot and did not make more of it than it was, which was a man coming around to a position he should have taken in October. People get there when they get there. Holding it against them after they've arrived is its own kind of waste. Spring came properly in April, unreliable and muddy, and full of the particular Kansas wind that had stopped feeling hostile and started feeling familiar, like weather you'd learned to work with rather than fight. The fence extension went in over 2 weekends, Caleb and Marin and Henry working the post holes in the wire in a line that moved steadily east, adding 20 yards of grazing to the north field the way she'd planned it in November. Henry was 8 now. He'd had his birthday in March, a quiet occasion involving the specific cake he'd requested. Spice cake, not chocolate, a preference he held with unusual firmness for a child. And a carved horse Caleb had made over the winter evenings, smaller than Captain, but with more detail. A second figure for whatever stories the 2 horses were living out on the kitchen table. He'd received both with the grave, proper appreciation of a boy who understood that gifts were significant. He'd also, somewhere in the winter, started coming down in the mornings before 5 and sitting at the kitchen table while Marin started the stove and put the water on. He didn't talk much at that hour, neither did she. But he sat there with whatever he was working on, his reader or a drawing, or just his own thoughts, and the company of it was something she'd come to count on without ever saying so. "You know what I want to be?" he said one morning in April, out of a long silence without looking up from his drawing. "Tell me." "A rancher." He said it with the complete lack of self-consciousness of a child who hasn't yet learned to qualify his ambitions. "Like Pa, but with more horses." "More horses than currently, or more than most ranchers?" He considered this. "Both." That's a good plan, she said. He looked up at her then. Do you think I could? She looked at him. This boy with his father's jaw and his particular measuring eyes and his 2 carved horses and his absolute sincerity. Yes, she said, without qualifying it, because he didn't need qualifications. He needed someone to say yes and mean it. I think you absolutely could. He went back to his drawing with the settled look of someone who has received information they needed. It was later that month that Caleb asked her, properly, in the plain and honest way that was his nature, not with constructed romance, not with ceremony, just in the evening after Henry was in bed and the kitchen was quiet and the lamp was lit. The same lamp in the same kitchen where everything between them had been slowly, stubbornly built. I want you to be here, he said. Not as hired help, not as the woman who keeps the accounts, as... He looked at the table, the old familiar posture when he was working through words. As mine. And I want to be yours. If that's... He looked up. If that's something you want. She had been waiting for this in the way you wait for something you know is coming, but don't want to rush toward. Because rushing is for people who aren't sure. And she was sure. Had been sure in January, sitting with soup she hadn't asked for, looking at a doorway that someone had walked away from after leaving something behind without requiring anything in return. Yes, she said. That's what I want. He reached across the table the same way he had in December, and she put her hand in his the same way. And it was not the first time, but it still had weight, still meant something specific and unrepeatable. I'm not easy to be with, he said. I want to be honest about that. Caleb, she said. Neither am I. Something loosened in his face. No, he said. You're not. And the way he said it was not a complaint, but its exact opposite. The acknowledgement of a man who had found, in difficulty, something he could trust. They were married in June, in the Dalton Creek courthouse, because neither of them was interested in ceremony for its own sake, only for what it actually meant. Henry wore his good shirt and his hair combed with water that didn't hold past the walk to town, and he stood beside his father with his hands in his pockets and an expression of dignified importance. Miss Pratt from the schoolhouse came because Henry had told her and she'd asked if she could. Tom Garrett came, which surprised her and did not surprise Caleb, and shook both their hands at the door with the manner of a man who has decided to be decent about something and is going to be fully decent about it now that he's committed. Harmon from the general store came. The woman who ran the boarding house where Marin had spent her first 2 nights, Mrs. Holt, sharp-eyed and practical and much warmer than she'd first appeared, came and brought a pie that she handed to Marin at the door with a brief, firm nod, the way she did everything. None of it was grand. It was just real. On the walk home afterward, the 4 of them, because Miss Pratt had come for the ceremony and then had her own way to go. Henry walked between them on the dirt road with one hand in his father's and one hand in Marin's, and he did not do this self-consciously or with any apparent awareness that it was remarkable. It was simply where his hands were. It was simply where he put them. She felt the weight of that small hand in hers and thought about the 7 miles she had walked in October, the carpet bag, the $2.40, the 4 lines of newsprint she'd carried in her boot like a talisman she wasn't sure would work. She thought about the woman who had walked that road, desperate, depleted, reduced to her most basic arithmetic. What do I have? What do I need? What will I do? She was not that woman now. Not entirely. The desperation was gone, and the depletion was gone, but other things from that woman remained. The stubbornness, the willingness to go at a problem directly, the particular refusal to dress things up as something they weren't. Those had not been products of hard times. They were just her. The way she'd always been, the way her father had been, the way, it turned out, Caleb was too. The hard times had just stripped away everything else and left those things visible. She thought that this was probably how it worked for most people who found their way somewhere real. Not that difficulty gave you something you didn't have, but that it took away everything you didn't need, and what was left, the grain of it, the actual material, was what you built with. What was left of her had been enough. That was the thing she hadn't known when she folded that newspaper and put it in her boot. That was the thing she knew now. The summer brought good weather and hard work and the garden she'd planned, which produced abundantly enough that she put up 30 jars of preserved tomatoes and 20 of beans and had enough squash by August to give 6 to Mrs. Holt and still have more than they could use. Caleb fenced the north extension, and the grazing improved, and the livestock numbers went up in a way that was modest but directional. The accounts moved steadily towards something she'd started allowing herself to call solid. Henry started 3rd grade in September and came home with a book about horses that he read 3 times in the first week and then read to Captain and the newer carved horse in the evenings, which Marin listened to from the kitchen and Caleb listened to from the doorway with an expression he probably didn't know she could see. One evening in the early fall, the air turning again, that October smell working its way back. Almost a year from when she'd first come down this road, she was in the garden, pulling up the last of the summer plants, making the ground ready for what came next. The sky was doing the amber and quiet thing that Kansas evenings did sometimes, the light going long across the grass, the shadows of the fence posts stretching east. She heard the gate, the properly latching gate, and looked up, and Caleb was coming across the yard from the barn, not hurrying, just walking toward her in the particular way of someone who knows where they're going, because where they're going is where they want to be. He came and crouched beside her and looked at the garden and looked at the sky. "Henry wants to know if we're having the biscuits tomorrow," he said. "Tell him yes." That's what I told him. They stayed there for a moment, both of them looking at the sky doing its amber thing over the Kansas land. "I walked this road a year ago," she said. "I know." He was quiet. "You showed up at my gate with a carpet bag and boots that weren't going to last the month." They lasted 6 weeks. Barely. She looked at the fence line, the extended section they'd put in together in April, the barn with the properly patched roof, the house with the straight porch rail and the functioning shutters, and a window latch in the east room that held against the cold. "It doesn't look like the same place," she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She thought about saying more and decided she didn't need to. The place spoke for itself, the work that was in it, the care that had been put into each repaired and strengthened thing, the incremental evidence of 2 people deciding, again and again, day by day, to stay and build rather than survive and wait. That was the actual story of this place, she thought. Not the storm, not the dramatic days, not even the evening in December when they'd put their hands together across the kitchen table. Those were real, but they weren't the substance. The substance was every ordinary morning she'd gotten up at 4:30 and made the fire. Every evening with the mending and the accounts and the lamp. Every fence post, every bundled wheat sheaf, every negotiation with Duchess of Trouble, every bowl of beans that were not like soup. Love, if that was what you called it, and she thought by now she could call it that, plainly, without qualification, was not a thing that arrived. It was a thing you built, board by board, with your actual hands, in all the ordinary weather of a life. It was the small horse on the kitchen table, and the fixed window latch, and the soup left on the chair. It was staying when staying was hard. It was choosing over and over to be present for what was real. She had walked 7 miles in October looking for breathing room. She had found, at the end of a dirt road, something she hadn't known she was looking for and wouldn't have had words for if she'd tried to name it in advance. A home was not a place. Or it wasn't only a place, it was what happened when you stopped passing through and started being present. When you let yourself need something and then stayed to tend it. When you looked at the difficult, imperfect, demanding reality of a life and said, quietly, without ceremony, on an ordinary evening with the sky going amber and the gate latching properly behind you, yes, this, here, mine. The prairie spread out to every horizon, enormous and indifferent as it had always been, unchanged by any of it. But the ranch sat in the middle of it, solid and particular and full of the specific accumulated weight of people who had chosen to be there, and the lamplight in the kitchen window pushed back a small portion of all that dark. And in that small portion was everything that mattered. Inside, Henry was reading to his horses. The biscuits were rising near the stove, and Blackstone Ranch held its ground.